In this session, Dr. David Trimble reflects on failures and therapy in the context of more than 7 decades of life, a spiritual journey in which his enthusiasms led him to stumble. Welcome to the AFTA podcast. I am Naveed Zamani and I am your host. In this session, I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. David Trimble. Dr. David Trimble has been teaching at the Center for Multicultural Training in Boston for more than 50 years. He has a clinical practice in Brookline, Massachusetts. His memoir, A Seeker's Journey into Sacred Time and Space, was published in February this year, 2025. This season, I'm asking folks for a story about a time in their clinical practice they feel that they failed and what they learned. So, David, I'm very happy to have you back on the show. And I know you're here to share a little bit as well about your memoir. So, very excited to learn from you today. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Naveed. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an interesting thing to think about talking in the electronic age about failures, given that one never knows where one's voice is going to go. My primary concern is the privacy of my clients.
Yes.
And so I'll not be sharing a lot of client details, but I certainly had plenty of time to think about failures and sort of how I failed, consequences. And it is, as it happens, there's a lot in the memoir that helps me to make sense of the failures. So just sort of a brief overview of the memoir. It's a narrative of my own spiritual journey, starting ancestrally many generations ago, but starting at the age of 9 with a nightmare that turned out to be a vision that turned out to set sort of my life's course. And it was a fairly tormented start to my spiritual journey, and I was of an age where we were experimenting with psychedelics and so forth in college. And so I went through a lot of detours. I had the good fortune of having Dr. Carolyn Atneve as my mentor. She's a charter member. She was a charter member of AFTA and was the first Native American PhD psychologist. So she trained me to work with large groups of people doing something called network therapy, which emerged out of family therapy. And it was through that course of events that I wound up learning from an espiritista when I was 30 years old. Espiritismo being a practice associated with African, Caribbean, and actually Northern European spirituality that has to do with working in collaboration with people from the spirit world. And my experience with Ramon Jimenez, the Espiritista, really charted my spiritual search. All of this is relevant to failures that I made as a family therapist, because essentially of my reaching more eagerly than I could grasp on a few occasions. I work on this problem a fair amount in the memoir because I'm a white cisgender heterosexual man in a colonizing country. And so ego is a significant problem for people of my ilk. And I write a fair amount in the memoir about the spiritual search and the struggles with ego. And it's in that context I think about the failures. The two failures that I want to bring forth both have to do with my integrating spirituality and psychotherapy and my almost colonizing eagerness to just get more and more and more, sort of greed in the spiritual discourse. It's problems of ego and problems of greed. And because of my experiences with the Espiritista, I developed certain capacities to work between the material and the spiritual world. And it was in my efforts to bring that into therapy which created the failures. I will say that the narrative, the memoir, goes on to talk about what I learned from that and how I learned to integrate spirituality and family therapy,
Mm.
much of which is documented in the AFTA Springer Brief that I had the good fortune to edit together with my dear friends, including Paulette Hines of blessed memory.
Mm.
So that's the context in which the failures appear.
Well, is it okay if I ask a little bit about the memoir as we kind of get into the
Sure, it's okay.
failures?
Yeah,
'Cause I imagine, I mean, I'm kind of being mindful that as you introduced the memoir, you kind of like pointed to this dream you had as a 9-year-old,
yeah,
and these journeys that you had along the way. And then at 30 years old, you're kind of like meeting with the Spiritista and finding some, I don't know if you say like a big shift or continuation of this journey. I'm
mhm,
sure it depends on the context. Um, So I guess there's a way where what feels unique to me in this conversation, David, compared to some of the other conversations I've had, is you're kind of locating the experience of failures within kind of your life's experience as told through the memoir, if that's fair.
yeah, yeah,
And you said something that like the memoir helps me make sense of the failures.
yeah.
Well, could you say more about that? Like, what does that mean to, and how did the memoir kind of shape your relationship to failures?
Well, the memoir was 15 years of deep self-reflection as I was writing. Um, it was very strange writing a memoir starting at age 60 with a certain kind of optimistic view of humanity's relationship to life on the planet, which by the time I published in 1978, a little less optimistic, frankly,
Mm,
about, about our near and far future. Um, let's see. I'm trying to see like how this makes sense. Um, I'm a reflective practitioner, trained in family therapy, went through all of the different convulsions and revolutions and discarding of the old and discovering of the brand new, and finally getting over the whole bright, shiny object feeling and trying to put it all together as I do in my practice, drawing from the very beginning to the end of family therapy and my psychotherapy training and my psychoanalytically oriented Boston area psychology training. Um, and particularly over the last few decades, bringing spirituality consciously and transparently into the psychotherapeutic
mm.
conversation. But I'm losing. I'm. Let me get your question to grip me a little more harder. So what is it? You're asking me how all of that shapes my sense of what my
Well,
failures.
I guess I'll look in kind of what drew my attention to it is that I mean, please forgive me or edit me if I misrepresent anything, but I think we're in different stages of our life. And
Sure.
so I think there's I guess a pull or draw or a fascination I have of what it might be like to even write a memoir and how the
Mm-hmm.
process of writing a memoir may actually change how I think about my life. And I don't know if that's part of it. And so I kind of was like thinking about what it might be like to sit, reflect for 15 years, like you said, about a journey, write it and document it, likely go through an editing process and kind of making uh, quite a personal journey, quite vulnerably public.
Yeah.
And then here you are in this podcast, and I'm asking you an even more vulnerable question of like, tell me about your failures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's kind of embedded within this reflective process you've had about the memoir. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if it's a question that's possible to answer or even if it's worth asking, but like what the memoir even has made possible to talk about failure, if that makes sense.
Oh, I would say that it certainly helps. But again, remember, it's 15 years in the life cycle, which is like a time of deepening reflection. Um, I sort of feel like my ego has less skin in the game. So when I think about these failures, which, you know, both of which happened before I started writing the memoir.
Hmm.
um, it's just easier to look at them, look at myself, and understand more clearly what I drew from them and how it's useful to teach from them. I mean, I've been teaching all my professional life, so and we are at different stages in the life cycle, so I can't help but adopt that role as I talk with you, Naveed.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
um, it makes it easier to look clearly and without being immobilized by shame, I would say,
Uh,
and with much less attachment to ego.
so is there something about having less skin, your ego having less skin in the game,
Mhm.
saying something about your relationship to shame?
Yeah. When I feel shame, I make sure that I don't wallow in it. And I see it as a very powerful salutary emotion.
Mm,
And it leads me spiritually into contemplating my attachment to ego and recognizing the illusion of ego and letting go of it.
yeah. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, in just my read of your memoir and kind of what you were sharing earlier, that correct me if I misunderstood this, that you kind of had this particularly fascinating and important participation in a critical time in family therapy's evolution. And I think
Mhm.
if I heard you right, you're something about in your professional world, you were kind of very accustomed to the discarding of the old, bringing in the new, kind of the reworking and reformulating of the field and how people think about each other and the work and clients. And it felt like, in some ways, as you're describing that, parallel to a personal journey you had in your like your spiritual personal journey as well.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, they happened in the same time frame, essentially. So, yeah. But maybe it would help to talk some about the failures
Yeah.
with that contextualizing. So here's all right. I'll talk bluntly about the failures and then go back to talk about how they make sense
Yes. Perfect.
reflectively. So in one case, so what had happened was I had acquired certain capacities, studying with the Spiritista, studying with texts, encountering other teachers along the way, and bringing a lot of this into my practice as a psychotherapist without any particular sort of religious identification.
Uh-huh.
But, and so in the absence of the religion, I just had my ego to congratulate me with how adept I was becoming. So I was already off course. I mean, I knew there was sort of there's a general knowledge and wisdom in spirituality. There certainly is. Um, and you can find aspects of that core knowledge in every spiritual tradition.
Mm.
But if you're sort of freestyling and sort of figuring you know more than any particular religious perspective, your ego is delighted with the opportunity to mess with you. So so I thought I was a pretty hotshot family therapist with individual and family therapists with some spiritual capacities in integrating spirituality and family therapy. I actually came out as a spiritual psychotherapy practitioner at a symposium to honor Carolyn Atney, my mentor at American Psychological Association, in which I laid out some of the principles of what I now call metaphysical therapy, which are in the memoir. Actually, those I talked about that presentation and articulated those principles. But basically, I kept reaching for more and claiming more than I should. And at the first error I want to talk about, I'm not sure what the chronology is, but the first one I want to talk about is I had been experimenting with bringing shamanic practice into psychotherapy. I have colleagues whom I deeply respect who are well identified as shamans. trained, if you will, as shamans. And I was working with a young man, occasionally with his mother in the sessions. And I had an experience when he talked about a moment when he felt something, an experience that I discerned that he was possessed. Now, that not to me, from my perspective, that's not, that's not an outlandish idea.
Mm-hmm.
And fancying myself to be more adept than I was and being a damn fool on top of it, I blurted out with this young man and his mother in the room that he was possessed. And I basically gave him instruction in how to turn to love as a way of combating the malevolent influence. And his mother was indignant. Now, his mother was not indignant because she didn't believe in this stuff. She didn't believe that it was true in this situation. And actually consulted with the pastor of that family later on in the course of all of this, who also did not think it was an outlandish idea, but did not think that that was what was going on in the session.
Uh-huh.
So later on my own, I entered the spirit world and engaged with this malevolent spirit, and fortunately survived the encounter. But I realized I was way above my pay grade.
Mm.
So not going into the details of that particular aspect of it, but I set the intention to never to do that again. But the thing is, I blurted it out.
Mm.
I said, "You're possessed." So basically, over an awkward and uncomfortable series of events in which there was a fair amount of healing of injury, the outcome was that was, in my opinion, prematurely interrupted as a treatment. So that was a bad mistake. I was also, I was in a bit of danger that I came to appreciate, and determined that I would never do depossession. I have colleagues and friends whom I trust and who do that. It's not my deal. And
Like
by
engaging with the malevolent spirits? Is that the danger?
yeah. That whole path of shamanism is a big piece of the memoir that talks about how I practiced it and what led me to abandon that course, which is related to the other failure. So that's one failure in which, in retrospect, as I wrote the memoir, I thought a lot about how two things. One was my enormous attachment to my ego and my exaggerated sense of my own proficiency and my tendency to brag about it. Brag about something that I believed I had, which I don't believe I had.
Mm.
But the other was, I was not at that time a Jew. I'm the descendant of many generations of Protestant ministers.
Mm.
There's a complicated intergenerational trauma family story in the memoir about how it is that I did not become the sixth or seventh generation Protestant minister, which I'll leave the reader to explore. But I actually wound up through a series of events. Well, I married a Jew. I agreed with her. We'd raise our children as Jews. We had one child. We raised him as a Jew. And I, in synagogue, did not experience the powerful allergic reaction that I had to Christianity. And I came to see how well integrated my spiritual practice was with practice as a Jew. There's a myth that when the Torah comes out of the ark during services, all the Jews who have ever lived, who will ever live, and who are alive now, all of us are at Mount Sinai when the Torah comes out of the ark.
Wow, it's beautiful.
And what was happening is I'm going to services pretty much not as a Jew, but as the parent of a Jewish child and the husband of a Jewish woman. And I experienced all the ancestors when the Torah came out of the ark. And when that happened enough times for me to see that I was, this was a real experience.
Wow.
That's when I made the decision to convert. And that makes an enormous difference in my metaphysical practice now, because I'm grounded. I identify myself transparently. Judaism has been around so long that practically every innovation in human spiritual practice has a place for it in the books. So, so this happened after I converted, actually.
The story that you just told about
the next one. A man came to me, and he'd been referred by actually a dear friend who's a rabbi, and started telling me his story. And I could see that he had a lot of transpersonal experiences. I could see that he was really troubled. I did not pause to do my due diligence as a psychologist because I didn't understand what he was dealing with. And I can't go too deeper into the details again, because this is a patient and, anybody in the world can hear this conversation.
Yeah.
But instead of being thoughtful and careful about what his particular struggle was, I started doing what I thought at the time was a way to get informed consent for spiritually informed psychotherapy, because not all of my therapy patients are sort of working with me in a way in which I'm transparently present as a spiritual person, as a Jew, and as a psychotherapist. Depends very much on the case, and how I make those distinctions is very much embedded in the text of the memoir as to how those distinctions get made. But he came in, he clearly was having transpersonal experiences. And I jumped the gun. I told him, I basically began the informed consent review in which I claimed to work, with companions beyond the material world. This was very, very difficult for him, because for him it violated all of his ideas of proper observance. And you can find in the texts that there are real problems if you consort with somebody who communicates with spirits. Now, as it happened after my son Jacob's death, he and I were in very strong connection for several years after he died. And so presenting myself as somebody who works between worlds was something I could say authentically, honestly. And I didn't stop to learn more about this person and how it would land. He freaked out. On the one hand, he felt drawn into the conversation with me. On the other hand, he felt this is something he couldn't do. And he actually wound up consulting with rabbis in the area. And a rabbi was a very observant Jew, but more sort of the modern Orthodox persuasion, the rationalist Maimonides tradition, basically said, there is some merit to that tradition in Judaism. It's not mine, but I know someone who is an expert in that, whose name I'm not going to use in this podcast. And if that rabbi says So you can work with David Trimble, you can work with David Trimble. So that rabbi was a dear friend of mine, is a dear friend of mine. And I wanted him to be I wanted to be his disciple, basically.
Hmm.
And he would have none of it. He wanted to be friends. And we are friends now. He's much more advanced, a much more advanced scholar than I could ever be in Judaism. So I asked my friend to be a rabbi with me and to examine me, because what the modern rabbi had said, if this rabbi says that David Trimble is monotheistic, it's okay to see him. So I asked my friend to examine me for monotheism. I love him. He was so uncomfortable with it, but he took it on.
Wait, what does it mean to examine you for monotheism?
For him to be a rabbinic authority, to have the authority of a rabbi to make a decision.
I see.
Which is pretty far from the terms of our friendship that he had sort of set for us to become friends, but he did it. And so we discussed that, and he determined that I was monotheistic. But then I talked to him about my practice and about how for many of my patients, I will basically get their permission to operate as an embodied, authentic, transparent spiritual being, and sometimes to pray for them. Not in the session, but later. And that praying involved this shamanic journeying. And my friend looked at me firmly, still in his rabbinic position, and said, "Don't pray for your patients, period." Now, he was a rabbi with me at that point. That was it. Okay, that was off the table.
Praying for your patients was off the table.
Yeah, but it was about time I stopped trying to play in the shamanic world and to integrate my practice much more with my religious identity and practice. So, I stopped journeying. I have on occasion done shamanic journeying for healing for people, Jews and Gentiles alike, but those are friends. They're not patients. My practice is so much better. I can't say I'll never make a damn fool mistake, but those are the two big damn fool mistakes when I think about failure. Was before I stopped claiming to practice in ways that are now forbidden to me, and just as well.
And they're forbidden to you now because in some part,
I'm a Jew. I asked a rabbi to make a
right, and that's shaped by these experiences. If that's
say what,
and it's shaped by these experiences that you're describing.
I'm not sure how
you're saying that these aren't practices that you engage with anymore unless they're like kind of with your friends or people that you know and trust, but
right.
Professional practice. And am I correct in understanding that at least these two experiences that you've described contributed to the position that you're holding, to not?
Well, you could say they led me that way in the sense that the universe organizes itself around the seeker. But Naveed, I stopped because, someone with the authority of a rabbi told me to stop.
I see.
That's why I stopped. And then I figured out, what good advice?
Yeah.
But it's not that the advice was good, but it was not because the advice was good. It was because the advice was from somebody whom I asked to take responsibility as a rabbi to make a discernment about my actions as a Jew. So
I don't know what you would call that, but it seems like a beautiful way to kind of surrender yourself to someone else's wisdom or understanding or kind of perspective, if that's.
Sure. And that's, practically any religion will talk about some equivalent of surrender.
Yeah.
And the 12-step meetings have a surrender practice too. They're not really different from each other. They all have to do with recognizing the perils and the limitations of ego.
Yeah. So I'm just going to share some reflections, and I have a question too, David. And I have to admit, I'm like really drawn into this conversation, both because just pure curiosity and interest, but also full disclosure, it's a bit outside of how I see the world or think of it, not because I don't want to or disagree, but just hasn't been necessarily my journey. I mean, for full disclosure, I grew up in a Muslim family, Iranian Muslim family, and I don't really practice. I was shaped by that religious cultural tradition history, but it's not like hugely, well, maybe if I write my memoir, I might understand it differently, but it's currently not hugely informative. And I probably take on the position of what you might consider anyone in the, or it might not be an unsurprising position of someone in the West, uh, like myself might be taking on, which is a general curiosity and interest in spirituality, but not a rigorous enough practice relationship to it to kind of come to some understandings that are probably, I don't know, that I'd probably want. But again, see, even as I'm talking about it, I'm still positioning my relationship to spirituality and religion in such a utilitarian way, which I think is
Yeah,
a bit of a Western approach to spirituality.
you could say that. I think that would be accurate in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about the Kyoto schools, just if you're familiar with some of their work on religion and spirituality. But I like one of the ways that I've understood, I'm drawn to this idea of surrender in the ways that, yeah, spirituality, religion, whatever kind of word we're using here, creates a context where we're able to see the world not through ourselves, like without centering necessarily
Yes.
ourselves.
Yes. Yes.
And I really like that. And it just kind of feels threaded through how you're describing this story. Can I ask a really rudimentary question here?
Go
What
ahead.
what is a transpersonal experience? I've actually never heard that term.
Oh, transpersonal experience basically is a generic term for moments when your consciousness uh, operates beyond the limitations of your sense of one's individual being. Now, it has the connotation. So you could say any good collective experience is a transpersonal experience. You
Mm,
know, if you're basically with a group and you're experiencing as the group, not just in the group, you
I
could say
see.
that's transpersonal. Um, it tends to have a connotation in this cultural context as beyond the limitations of the material world, that one's consciousness is going beyond one's material embodied beings and perhaps other embodied beings around you into consciousnesses beyond the limits of living embodied beings. That tends to be the connotation of it.
And so, okay, thank you for explaining that. Yeah. And it seemed like thematically there's two experiences that you shared. And again, I really appreciate you managing the issues of confidentiality as we're talking about this. So thank you for that. But it seems like there was something about, you said the the first story that you shared was like something about blurting something out prematurely. And the second one was instead of kind of being thoughtful and careful, you kind of proceeded with a process
Right,
or really
right.
connecting with what was going on for the person.
Yeah, and what was going on with the person was such that um, what I was doing was fitting into a very tightly bound and configured um, mental disorder. I really hesitate to use the diagnosis, but it's a kind of belief system that is impervious to to any contrary information. And people who live with this condition can have a view of the world that doesn't fit the worldview of anyone around them, but it's absolutely true
Right.
in their minds. And I am deeply sorry, I have expressed my remorse. I have not been forgiven, but it's not for me. It's for him to decide whether to forgive me or not. So,
Yeah. I appreciate sharing such a vulnerable story. If I can ask, and maybe forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing some of what you said, that there's this world in which I don't know, I'm kind of like drawn, I'm really attracted to this way you're talking about a transpersonal experience, how we're connected to a broader collective, that these collective experiences transcend an embodied material presence,
yeah.
and that there's experiences that happen in there. And then
Hmm.
there's this alternate, correct me if I'm wrong, alternative way of describing those experiences in perhaps Western medicine of diagnoses and disorders and mental health disorders. Is that
No, I'm
correct?
not.
Like,
I'm not suggesting that. I'm sorry if that's the impression I give.
oh no, I guess I wanted to say that like is I guess I'm not saying that that's what you're saying. Am I kind of describing two different frames of viewing someone's experiences, like where you might be understanding it through a transpersonal experience?
Right.
Western medicine might look at it and say, this is a psychological problem that needs to be addressed with medicine or treatment plans and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I got to complicate that a little for me to agree
Please,
with you.
yes.
Okay. Um, there's certain conditions where you don't do anything that could possibly feed a delusional system.
I see.
Period. End of a story. And yet there are many, many people suffering from a psychosis, inactive psychosis, who are having meaningful spiritual experiences. And the approach of psychiatry is to medicate it and to suppress it.
Mhm.
This is where Jaakko Seikola's work is so enormously important, the open dialogue approach, because in contrast to, you know, diverting a person away from talking about their um, terrifying and confusing experiences, you listen thoughtfully and carefully and respectfully and attentively, and you bring it into the conversation. There is a reasonable amount of preliminary evidence that open dialogue can work a lot better than medicine in many contexts,
Mm,
certainly with less medicine in many contexts. I'm not as radical as some of the current open dialogue proponents are. I mean, I think there is mental illness. I mean, I say that because also in the memoir, I recount in some detail my experience of a psychosis when I was psychotic and hospitalized in a state hospital in the middle of my graduate training,
mm,
which was, as you can only imagine, fairly humiliating. Um, also enraging in the sense that I know what it's like as a person who does not experience reality conventionally, and also as a person who's been, I think, diagnosed as mentally ill. The actual diagnosis was not accurate, but that I was psychotic was unquestionable.
mm.
So so here's the thing. I work with a lot of people who struggle with significant mental illness. And I'm totally open with them. I'm open and transparent about myself. And I don't see anything that they're experiencing as reducible to or another way of looking at um, what they're experiencing. I don't think there's a Western psychiatric way to look at who they are and what their experience is and say, oh, that's different from who they are spiritually.
I see.
There are some people with certain conditions, though, where if you don't see how tightly wound it is, you're going to cause a lot of harm if you keep sort of feeding it. That's very rare.
Yeah.
Most Western psychiatrists will medicate and dismiss any aspect, any spiritual aspect to a psychotic person's experience, which I think severely impairs the healing process
Mm.
and is profoundly contemptuous of lived experience. And I've been on both sides of that, if you will. So
Yeah, and perhaps as an listening to you talk, David, perhaps even the frame of my question reinforced a binary between
Yes, it does. Yeah.
psychiatric experiences and spiritual
Mhm.
experiences, and then perhaps they're
Mhm.
a lot more intertwined and maybe at times connected, maybe at times not, but that perhaps like as someone who like let's say like myself might receive someone's story in a Western context, I might be like afraid to engage or maybe not have the ability to identify the nuance in the ways that you're talking. Like, okay, it's all possible at the same time. That it could be
Mhm.
spiritual
Yeah.
experiences, it could be psychotic experience of psychoses, and all the other things all together.
Yeah. Great.
It does feel kind of like, I'll just be honest, like I can like appreciate the nervousness of like engaging with someone's story, identifying what I might describe, or maybe they are too, as psychoses. Then they proceed to talk about spiritual experiences and then feel like I'm then reinforcing psychoses by engaging with the spiritual features.
Yeah, but that's more that's you and the observer. It's not in the lived experience of the person.
Yes.
The person needs somebody who can basically, to paraphrase, look, I got both feet in reality, but I got a pretty good idea from what you're saying of what you're experiencing. Boy, that sounds scary, or that sounds, gee, that might even sound like fun, you know. Um, but um, let's take a look at where and how you're living and what do you want to do about that. But I'm open to everything that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, I really appreciate it. It's like kind of really expanding how I think about my work. I mean, okay, I don't want to ask too simplistic of a question, so you can dismiss this question if you'd like, but like, how do you think about, or I don't know if you train some of these ideas or not, but like, how do you support practitioners in thinking about this nuance or like making these distinctions?
oh, I teach about it. I'm older. I'm not teaching as many hours, and I teach psychologists, and psychology has a very strong allergy to spirituality, despite all the
Right.
APA publications to the contrary. Um, I try to teach and model openness, um, and readiness to be a fully authentic, embodied presence with another person. And I encourage people to basically find a community in which they can cultivate their spirituality.
Mm,
I mean, my memoir is the story of a spiritual journey, but it's also an aspect of my political activism from before birth. I mean, but from before birth, I come from preachers. But from before birth, I also come from a Trotskyite socialist set of parents. How my father was able to be an ordained Methodist minister and a Trotskyite is beyond me. Um, but I was born a revolutionary in the McCarthy era, so it was all mystified and not directly articulated by my parents, who didn't want us to say anything in school
right.
that would get them in deep shit in a Republican town. So I wrote the memoir. Well, I mean, I started the memoir because I wanted to document my meditative practice, but the revolutionary quickly took hold because I've gone from being sort of a civic virtue activist, abolitionist, Yankee progressive, Teddy Roosevelt type,
Uh-huh.
till the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where I became totally disillusioned with the American political process. I became a dialectical materialist. The Black Panther Party was very active. I was married to a Black woman. I'm a white man. I was married to a Black woman at the time. Two of her sisters were in the Black Panther Party.
Mm,
My father had a whole bookshelf of Marx and Engels. And so I, became a dialectical materialist. But as my spirituality continued to develop, I stopped accepting materialism as a way of understanding the world because my first political action at the age of 17 was to stand out in a park during a national air raid drill that John F. Kennedy had organized to show the Russians that he wasn't afraid to fight a nuclear war. So that was my one and only arrest in my entire political active career.
That's a damn good arrest.
But I got my ass arrested. So what is coming to at my advanced old age is the entire planet is headlong headed toward extinction of life by the dominant species. And what I came to on my political and spiritual journeys, they converged. And I saw, unless humanity has a common culture that respects every single human being as an embodiment of a soul, then we're going to continue to otherize and objectify and murder each other and use up the planet to extract its resources. So they come together finally. And when I did the After Springer brief, when my colleagues and I gathered for that, it was basically that's where I learned. See, the big problem was saying, well, if we had a global culture that was spiritual and not materialist, I mean, I think the murderous culture, the dominant murderous global culture is materialist individualism.
Uh-huh.
So, but we can't have world peace when people are willing to kill each other for God. And are people really ready to kill each other for God?
Right.
I mean, so that's when I drew this group together, all of whom are deeply grounded in serious faith and whose serious faiths are profoundly different from each other. A Sufi Muslim, a Sunni Muslim, a Taoist, a Roman Catholic, one Roman Catholic drawing on his African roots, another Roman Catholic drawing on this amazing thing called constellations, which actually comes out of Zulu African culture and German guilt. I hope I'm interesting people in reading the Afterbrief.
I was going to say you're doing an incredible job, marketing some of it unintentionally.
And and my dear sister of blessed memory, Paula Hines, like me, a descendant of preachers, and like me, struggling with that legacy, who wrote about working with African American Protestant spirituality. All of us wrote about our work with our patients. None of us had the same religion, and we had powerful, powerful shared spiritual experiences, which I came to call sacred space. And so that's a lifetime coming together as an activist. And I'm sort of curious where your journey will take you. You're about at the place in one's journey that a Western educated person with complicated ancestry might be. You remember in our previous podcast, we talked about being allergic to religion and spirituality.
That's right.
So, but you're on a journey.
Yeah, I am on a journey, and I think fatherhood has had a huge impact on me. I think, I'll say this. I think there's ways that the kind of current political systems and processes, kind of this, what feels like an existential threat to our lives and globe, at times has me learning and engaging with a sense of nihilism at some ways.
Yeah.
And I've kind of come to appreciate nihilism in the ways that, like, I guess I'm familiar with some of the ways that Nietzsche has talked about nihilism, but that was kind of when I was mentioning the Kyoto School, there's some ways that it kind of invites us to consider nihilism as actually a really useful thing to lean into because it's making visible some of the deeper questions that we're holding about ourselves and the world and
Hmm.
our relationship to it. So I've kind of been trying to not um, fight off nihilism like I have in the past and actually kind of allow it some sort of path towards a broader spiritual understanding, if that
Hmm.
makes any sense. Now, where that's headed, maybe I'll, in our next podcast in a year, I'll share there. And probably it'll still be a limited answer. But I have to say, David, I just have so much appreciation for how you're describing it. Like, yeah, you've lived a life that is usefully different from mine and have been on a journey that I'm so attracted to. And like you mentioned, like, and I was thinking, whether intentional or not, and for folks listening, I think you've created a really curious pull to your memoir because I just want to learn so much more about everything you're sharing here today.
Well, I welcome people to read it. It turns out not to be an easy read. I'm learning from my readers, not because the writing is impenetrable. Jody Kleiman, my wife, is also my beloved editor,
Hmm.
and she's did a great job with the editing. The language is clear, but I'm talking about the death of a child.
Yeah.
I'm talking about a lot of things that are a struggle to. It's a struggle for the reader to go there.
Right.
Um, Spiritual journey. I have a new dear friend who's nothing but joy, you know, and he read my memoir, and we're both very spiritual people. And he's sort of going, well, but it's all God. It's wonderful. And I think there are many, many different ways that people follow their path. Mine is shaped, I think, a great deal by compassion
Hmm.
and compassion and loss and sorrow. Um, I'm an enormous optimist, but I also have a broken heart.
Hmm.
So, and I do think that sometimes, sometimes it's an open heart is a broken heart,
Hmm.
and so it is.
That's really beautifully described. David, thank you so much for sharing some of your journey in life and being vulnerable enough to share some of your failures here on this podcast. I know to an invisible audience that might listen to it over time. Um, if folks want to find your memoir or kind of engage with it more, do you have any recommendations for where and how?
Sure. I mean, I'm David Trimble, Trimble. It's a seeker's journey into sacred time and space. You can get it on Amazon. If you prefer not to give Jeff Bezos any money, you could go to resource publications on the web and you can order it that way. Amazon comes faster, but it's a slow read. You could go to resource publications and put in my name and the title, A Seeker's Journey into Sacred Time and Space, or any small, any combination of elements. I mean, the web browsers do an amazing job
They
of,
do.
of finding things.
They
So,
do.
and I'm working now, and it's nowhere near as much fun as writing the memoir. I'm sort of calling one bookstore after another, and basically urging them to consider putting it on their bookshelves. It is being distributed by the standard bookseller distribution, but there's many, 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 many more books being printed than before.
Right.
And then there's the whole self-publishing and
Right.
the illicit marriage with Amazon for self-publishing. And there's only so much physical space. And by the way, according to the surveys, people aren't reading books anymore. So it's a challenge to get it out there. I hope this conversation inspires people to get it. And I hope when they read it, it will inspire them to recommend it to others. And I'm pretty easy to find on the web. And I'd be happy to engage with anybody who's curious about all of this.
Thanks so much, David, for your openness and for your time here today.
Thank you very much, Naveed. It's wonderful. Take care.